Maraming salamat po. That's a very graphic picture all around of what's happening in Zamboanga, and the backward and forward links, a very complicated story that Manila should really appreciate with greater attention to the nuances. Okay, last but not least, we call on Professor Julkipli M Wadi, the Dean of the UP Institute of Islamic Studies.
Thank you. Well, my friend Prof. Ed started with a disclosure. I also would like to begin with a disclosure. Some of you might have seen me articulating things related to not only the Zamboanga standoff, but many issues about Mindanao, the Middle East, and so on. But I'm particularly interested of disclosing this small fact that with the burning of that part of Zamboanga, it resonated in me, the burning of Bolo. That was around just 40 years ago, when I was barely around 5, 6 years old. Two of my siblings, younger brother and sister, died in the process of our running, evacuating from one place to another. Probably hundreds of my relatives perished or were displaced, either to Zamboanga and to Sabah. But this does not make me less objective in my articulations, or say, probably some of you might think my inclinations to the Moro fronts, either the MNLF or the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. I've long decided that there are many problems that the country face. I could hardly see the coherence in the politics within the government or in the Moro fronts. So I decided to take a distance, not to engage. When Nur Miswari was on his peak of power before his arrest last few years ago, we had casual invitations inviting me to participate in his administrations. But I immediately said that there are many ways by which we could advance the cause of peace. In the same manner, a high-ranking MILF official visited me one time, that was a long time ago, to participate, or in fact to become part of the movement. I just felt that there was lacking in the way the politics and the struggles were being advanced in the Moro struggle. This is not a criticism in terms of the weakness or the pitfalls of the Moro fronts, but probably I have my own standard in looking at the problem in the South, including the Moro struggle. This also doesn't mean that I have embraced the government and hence my perspective is subsumed under the state or government interest. In fact, I have long abandoned the study of politics to show my abhorrence in the way chaos actually governs rather than the coherence that I'm expected to work on so that we can envision a nation that is not simply dictated by the interests of particular groups, but by the interests of the collective, not only the Filipinos, but even the Muslims in the South. I felt that there is room in advancing the voice of reason and in the cause of peace amidst this chaos. And I commend the presentations of our friend Chito in his opening statement that when he recognized the fundamental problem that is attendant to the moral question, and his recognitions on the divergence of positions, not only between the moral fronts and the government, but even the intra relations in the liberation movements. But having noted the essential fundamental problem in the peace process, what the Office of the Presidential Assistance in the Peace Process or other entities could have done is to go back and forth to the drawing board to continuously examine or assess the policy directions, the strategy and tactics that government is doing. In the initial trust of this administration, we were very elated when it advanced the idea of convergence, that is putting together the MILF, and the army to sort of provide them a venue where they could engage in a conversation so that a comprehensive peace process could proceed. We were initially part of a project of the need to reframe the bungled MOA AD in 2008 that now resulted into the framework agreement on the Bangsamoro. What I could hardly understand is why the convergence was left and a rather unilateral or segmented peace approach was concentrated with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And I think this started the deterioration in the crumbling of the Aquinos peace process. The convergence, by the way, started with President Ramos in his project in the 1996 peace agreement. In my view, he would like to get the Moro National Liberation Front through the 1996 peace agreement. Few months later, he entered into a peace talk with then Chairman Salamat Ashir, and an initial peace agreement was signed between the government and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. I think the project of Ramos is get the MNLF first, get the MILF later, then put them in a negotiating table so that the comprehensive peace process could happen. That was a project, but I guess President Ramos didn't have the luxury of time by 1998, and the new administration came. Now this is a sickness in Philippine political culture where each administration has its own style and even has its own propensity to craft its own policy, regardless of the policy that were already put in place, if only to sort of make such an administration be the one to be recognized rather than the previous administration. In other words, there is discontinuity in the visions of peace, in the peace strategy by each administration, leading therefore in the crumbling of the peace dividend that was put in place in 1996. The Estrada administration, using its own style and approach, resulted in the launching of the all-out war. Then one time, in a conversation, I said this in other forums, with then Secretary Reyes, I told him, General, by attacking the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, the armed forces of the Philippines committed a strategic blunder. The MILF, they will be able to get Kamba Bubakar, but they will just disperse and re-strengthen their forces outside. And I told him, you may be able to wage peace, up to wage war against the MILF today, but tomorrow you still have to make peace with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And that was the context with the entry of President Arroyo. The problem was, I think, the Arroyo administration was engaged in a fishing mode in looking for partners or country that would help convince the Moro Islamic Liberation Front to go back to the negotiating table. But because of the lack of strategic thinking or even a poor historical appraisal, the administration of President Arroyo invited Malaysia to participate as facilitator. And that complicated the problem because that would mean initially tilting the balance of a kind of a relationship of maintaining some kind of parity in the treatment, in the peace process between the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and the Moro National Liberation Front. Why do you have to take into account the role of Malaysia in the GPH-MILF peace process? We have to remember that the beginning of the MNLF rebellion started with the Jabida massacre, which was in turn connected to the issue of Sabah Line. At the time, Malaysia transferred the burden by creating the MNLF, by creating Luis Wadi, and therefore the problem becomes a problem between the Philippine government and the Muslims in the Philippines, leaving Malaysia safe. This kind of geopolitics in the peace process should have been taken into account. Because if you remember, it was in 2001 when Malaysia also captured Luis Wadi and threw him back to the Philippine government, and he was incarcerated in jail. With this background, it should have been taken into account by the peace architects in the government that Ms. Wadi has some kind of a psychology that is too entrenched and too deep. And this is shared somehow by some of his followers. A feeling that they were victims of the geopolitics between Malaysia and the Philippines. When the Jabida massacre exploded, Ms. Wadi was here, just like any other faculty at the university, doing nothing. But two guys went to him at the teacher's village, short of embarrassing him. Noor, what are you doing here in UP? Your relatives, your people are being killed by the military. I think the guy was embarrassed. He felt ashamed. Then he took the cudgel. Then he led the Moro National Liberation Front. In other words, this has been taken into account. Why there is such an entrenched psychological reason why we have to look at the Moro front separately. We cannot lump them together and take and adopt a policy strategy that would try to sort of minimize the long historical antecedents or even the divisions that lead them to part ways. The MNLF has no reason to accept Malaysia because it has nothing to do with the Sabah Plan. But Malaysia would want to come in because at least that would sort of divide the Moro fronts so that if there will be struggles in the Western Mindanao and the Sulu Archipelago, then they cannot get any support from the Mindanao-based Moro Islamic Liberation Front. By the time of President Arroyo, instead of facilitating the looming factions in the MNLF, it was in the MNLF, it was in fact instigated, it was factionalized and more. And now, it's quite ironic that the present government is propping up these factions. Therefore, one time I was with Secretary Dele's secretary, you might be simply photocopying the divide and rule tactics of President Marcos, which failed miserably since then. Besides, you'll probably be just creating monsters out of this and new traditional politicians who will simply amass wealth and would not share the development for the development of the Moros. This is the reason why when the reframing on the need to pursue the convergence, we felt that that was the way. Now, when the government concentrated simply with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, that I think that explained the sense of discouragement on the part of Nur Miswari and the Moro National Liberation Front. And this, the government should have seen the clouds, the looming dark clouds that would have happened because the trajectory of the MNLF reassertion since the release of Nur Miswari was such that it was really trying to advance a cause. But I think the government simply neglected, thinking that it will not come this far. What was the looming dark clouds? Remember the Lahad standoff. It was not by another group, but it was the consequence of the entry of Malaysia into the GPHC Mayalan peace process. And it was just around 8 months before the Zamboanga standoff broke. In other words, two standoffs in the supposed safe havens of evacuees, Sabah and Zamboanga, but are now the subject of attacks by the Moro National Liberation Front. If the government would insist to simply concentrate its undertaking with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, our fear is that would not stabilize Western Mindanao and the whole of the Sulu Archipelago.
In fact, that would even heighten the ethnic division in the Moro France. And that is worse. Because at the time that we should have actually effaced the division so that at least we could facilitate the convergence. And more so when a timetable was crafted, say, the formations of the Bangsamoro by 2016, and now the Aquino government has only around 3 years to accomplish this. And we would like to fit all our peace initiative into this 3-year timetable. We are talking here of a century-old problem. Then we would like to fit into this 3-year timetable. I doubt if it's really a formula for success. What we are saying is the drawing board or the strategy in the drawing board was such that the government should have taken a step further to maintain its rationality on account of the highly psychological and historical entrenched concern of the Moro National Liberation Front, rather than would stoop itself by giving in into the posturing of Julkipli Wadi. One time I told Secretary Deles, Secretary, kailangan habaan lang na po natin ang pasensya. Because Miss Wadi, probably because of his training here at this university, he was fond of giving lectures. You know, even to the negotiators. And sometimes he would appear very critical. Then I told the Secretary, do not be intimidated by such posture of Julkipli Wadi. During the time of President Corazon Aquino, she sent both Aquino and Nene Pimentel to sort of calm down Julkipli Wadi and develop some kind of intimacy with him. With the President Ramos, he sent Ruben Torres to convince him to agree to the formula that the government presented at the time. Unfortunately, in this time, they don't have that kind of strategy of trying to reach out to Julkipli Wadi and talk to him intimately. Because during intimate moments, Miss Wadi is really like a ship. A mean like a ship. If you give in to the posturing, or you are intimidated to the posturing of Julkipli Wadi, then it will really lead to nowhere. The legalism is also very strong in this peace process. One time I told Secretary Deles in one casual conversation, I said, the problem with your peace process is you have two bottles, botelya. Maluwag kayo sa MILF, pero mahigpit yung botelya ninyo, yung takip ng botelya ninyo sa MILF. Why don't you, I said, loosen both cups and facilitate, in fact, the convergence. In other words, the government should not only act as negotiator to the two fronts, but would in fact act as facilitator. So that somehow a conversation could happen between the two. The role of the Organization of Islamic Conference should have been harnessed, because since the Tajikistan conference, 3 or 4 years ago, this has been the concern of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. My problem with the Jeddah formula is that that is already part of the project to oust Julkipli Wadi from the picture. You know, when you try to terminate the peace review and would say, we will continue the peace engagement, question, would Ms. Wadi be still part of the process, or you will prop up new politicians? If that is your formula, then the Jeddah formula would not also be productive. I'm very sure many of you are already gearing to ask questions to our speakers. I will not prolong my talk, but I'm I'm very thankful to the IID and our sponsoring organization for organizing this. Thank you very much.